Every single story has a beginning. And for The Legend of Zelda, that story takes place before there was a Hyrule, before there was a Ganondorf, before there were legends of a hero who sealed evil away with a sacred blade, or a princess with a royal bloodline that was born with special powers. It's a story that explains so many different elements of our other favorite Zelda games. But at its core, it's the story of one person doing whatever it takes to save someone they truly care about. That story is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Hey everybody, it's Kebra. That's me, I'm Kebra. Hey. Welcome back to How to Adapt The Legend of Zelda. Now the first game we're going to take on is Skyward Sword. Now if you haven't watched the first 3 videos where I talk about the general rules of how to adapt the Legend of Zelda franchise, click on the link in the corner, watch those videos first, then come back. Now if you've already seen those videos, let's get started. Now it should come as no surprise that the first film adaptation of the Legend of Zelda games should be Skyward Sword. It's the first game in the timeline and sets up a lot of the lore that will become recurring elements in the series. I know it's not everyone's favorite game, but that's mostly because of the gameplay mechanics, like the motion controls or revisiting the same lands over and over again. But you never really hear people say they thought the story and characters were terrible. Also, the fact that it's not everyone's favorite works to our advantage because there are a lot less die-hard fans to be upset about changes in the story. Hey Nintendo, I didn't like those changes you made in the adaptation, so get ready to feel the wrath of all 5 Skyward Sword fans because they're coming for you. And another big perk of starting with Skyward Sword is that it prepares the fans to see what kinds of changes there would be in an adaptation such as this before you adapt the fan favorite games. I was completely not blindsided by all those changes they made in Ocarina of Time after watching Skyward Sword. So now that we've established why it's first, let's talk about the basic story that's in the game. It starts off with a brief synopsis about Hylia, Demise, and why Skyloft is in the sky. We then introduce some characters, have some minor conflict, but the story doesn't truly start until Zelda gets sucked into a tornado and falls down to the surface world. After that, Link meets Fi, gets the Goddess Sword, and then finds out a little bit about his destiny. He then journeys down to the surface world, meets an old lady, then tries to track down Zelda, going from province to province until he finally watches her go through a gate of time. At that point, Link fights the imprisoned, goes back and travels to each province a second time, but now it's because he wants to purify the Goddess Sword. Then fights the imprisoned a second time, and then after that, he uses his purified sword to go through the second gate of time at the sealed temple. Remember when I talked about wash, rinse, and repeat in my last video? No reason, just randomly bringing it up. And now that Link is finally reunited with Zelda, he gets another sword enhancement and learns that he has to go back to the present and visit each of the 3 provinces for a third time. Then he fights the imprisoned for a third time. Then he goes and visits a giant whale, but hey, you know what, I guess that's new. Once Link has learned the full song of the hero, he uses it to reach the Triforce and wishes for Demise's demise. And just when you think everything is happy and wonderful, Girahim kidnaps Zelda and goes back in time to release Demise from his prison before he was killed, which means you have to go back in time, beat Girahim for the 3rd time, beat Demise for a 2nd time, although it's technically the 5th time if you count the other 3 times you had to defeat him as the imprisoned. Once all of that is done, the characters can finally celebrate their victory as they eternally imprison Fi within a sword. So, clearly, we're not doing all that. Like I said earlier, these games tend to repeat themselves a lot, which isn't a good story mechanic outside of video games. However, we do have a partially good outline to work off of, so the first thing we need to ask ourselves is what should stay and what should go. Should it stay or should it go? Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. I like music. Let's start with characters. The most obvious 3 we have to keep are Zelda, Link, and Demise. But what about the other characters? Impa is a great character because we get two different versions of her. The younger version doubts Link's ability, which gives us some conflict, and she's also the only human who can help both Link and Zelda once they arrive on the surface. She rescues Zelda from Girahim when Zelda falls to the surface, and she can share a lot of exposition to both Zelda and Link. You absolutely need to keep this character. Gaepora is a character that seems pretty important, but honestly doesn't do a lot. If you take him out, it doesn't really affect the plot. However, just because he doesn't help move the plot forward, that doesn't mean that he can't play an important role when it comes to the emotion of the story and fleshing out the main characters. No one would be more broken over Zelda's disappearance than her own father, and there would be no better person for Link to talk to about his best friend missing and potentially being dead than with Gaepora. Also, since Link doesn't have parents, Gaepora can come across as a father figure to Link. So, although you can get rid of him, I would recommend keeping him to give Link and Zelda another meaningful relationship in the movie. That being said, you also have to make sure he's written well enough for the emotion to be there. I've never played Assassin's Creed, but the opening scene in the movie has one of the least dramatic openings in a film because it kills off the kid's mom, but I don't know who she is, and I literally just met this kid 30 seconds ago. So I don't care that this mom just died, it's a random person to me. And I don't care that this kid's mom died because I don't know him either. They were characters that I could not care less about because I had no investment in them. So if you put Gaepora in a script, he needs to be in scenes before the tornado happens. And you need to establish a relationship between him and Link and him and Zelda. That way when Zelda goes missing, the audience will feel sympathy towards him. Groose is a fan favorite, which is a fact that surprised me when I found out because I hated him the first time I played the game. He reminded me of a school bully from the 1950s, like he was some sort of greaser. He seemed so out of place and I couldn't stand him on my first playthrough. But the second time I played the game, I actually kind of liked him. He was still goofy and had bad hair, but that was part of his charm. He also has a great character arc that we don't typically get to see from characters in the Legend of Zelda games. In some ways, he's exactly like Tattle from Majora's Mask. Both start off as more antagonistic and against our main character, but then both eventually work together with Link to save the world. However, is he important enough that he has to be in the movie? I would argue that because of his character arc, because he's antagonistic before we meet the true villains, and because he can potentially play an important role in the story, I think it would be a really good idea to put him in the script, but it's not completely necessary. Next up, we've got Fi, who I know is not exactly a fan favorite. A lot of people hate her even more than Navi. Because just like Navi, she continuously pops up when you do not want her to and just annoys you. No, I don't need you to help. If I did, I would have asked. However, unlike Navi, she is an actual character. She has a character arc. She grows, she develops, she has a personality eventually. And while I don't think it exactly resonates well in the game, I think in an adaptation of a movie, you could really do it justice. Also, she's part of the Master Sword, and the Master Sword is a recurring element throughout the entire franchise. So it feels like she should be part of this story. She also plays the vital role of transitioning from Link not knowing what to do, to guiding him to the Goddess Sword, and then telling him he needs to go down to the surface world. And once he's on the surface world, since he's never been there before, she also makes a very good guide for him. So for all of those reasons, I'm going to say that yes, Fi should be in the adaptation. As for the rest of the characters on Skyloft, none of them actually matter. I know people love Pip and Beetle and... I'm not gonna even pretend to know how to pronounce that guy's name. Is it Betrayal? Betrayox? I don't know if the X is silent. And it's Bat guy, the Bat boy. Yeah, him. And I know other people love other characters around Skyloft, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be in the script, but I am saying that it is perfectly okay to cut them out and that not a single one of them should be forced into the script because they are not important to the story. Now, if you feel like Link needs a friend for a scene that's not Zelda, you can absolutely use Pip. Or if you want Link to buy Zelda a gift in your script, you can use Beetle as the person to sell it to him because that makes sense. But you shouldn't write a scene in a shop just because you want to include Beetle. These types of characters have to serve the story, not the other way around. Otherwise, you end up with scenes that are completely irrelevant, or have dumb plot threads just because you chose a character over the story itself. I love the script. It's phenomenal. Wouldn't change a thing. Here's a list of characters you need to shoehorn in because they're fan favorites. Now let's move from the sky down to the surface, starting with Gorko. Gorko is a character that I want to say yes to, but only because every single 3D Zelda game has at least one Goron. He doesn't really matter to the story, so I wouldn't force him in as an actual character, but I think if you do a Legend of Zelda film series, it would be nice to have one Goron cameo in every single movie, even if it's just Link running by a nameless Goron. So I'm gonna say that Gorko probably shouldn't be in the script, but we should see at least one Goron, even if it's only in the flashback when we see the war against Demise. Now, because I brought up the Gorons, let's go ahead and talk about some of the other races that are on the surface world. There are lots of races that we see in this game and only this game. Magua, Kikwi, and the Ancient Robots. I think all three should be included since they never get to be in another game. However, there are no specific characters from those races that are necessary. So, Maki, Scrapper, Skipper, Lead, Cobalt, none of these characters need to be in the script. We could simply just have them in the background as Link journeys through each province and never have him actually meet one. But he probably should meet at least one or two of these characters just so Link has another person on the surface world to interact with, but no one specific. So yes to all the races, but a no to needing an individual character of those races. Now let's move on to some of the larger-than-life characters like Lanayru, Pharaon, Eldon, and Levias. It's Levios, not Levias. You go to hell and you die right now, okay? The White Whale and the Three Dragons all play a very pivotal role in the Skyward Sword story, but they basically have the exact same function. All of them are just there to give you a piece of the hero's song. It's redundant and we don't really need it. To be honest, I don't think we even need the hero's song, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So I would argue that you don't need these characters. However, I would also argue it's easy to fit the dragons in for the same reason it's easy to fit the different races on the surface world in. Because if Link has to travel to each province anyway, they could help Link with each objective he needs to complete. Levias is a bit trickier because Link has to go back up to the sky, which I think is unnecessary since we start in Skyloft and we spend the first major chunk of the movie there. I guess you could have Link meet Levias before he goes down to the surface world, but I don't think you want to do that because when Link first goes down to the surface world, you want Link to have a lot of wonder and awe at this brand new world. And if right before that moment he met a giant whale spirit, I just feel like that's gonna undercut the magic of this brand new world. So I'm gonna say that these characters don't have to be in the movie, but I can easily see them being written into the movie for good reasons. Up next, let's talk about the three main villains: Girahim, the Imprisoned, and Demise. I think keeping all three of them is a big mistake. I know I'm probably gonna make a lot of people mad by saying this, but one needs to be cut, especially if you want Link to fight other smaller villains throughout the movie. So let's start with Girahim. Girahim is a great villain to have because he can be Link's main antagonist until Demise is released. He can talk to Link, threaten Link, cause problems, and be a thorn in Link's side from the moment that Link sets foot on the surface world. He should absolutely be in the movie. Now let's move on to the Imprisoned. And the Imprisoned is a boss battle. That's literally it. It's the big monster that comes out every time you go back to the Sealed Temple just to give you a monster fight. It really serves nothing to the story. If anything, he makes Demise's human form seem less intimidating. Now don't get me wrong, I think the character design of Demise is badass, while the Imprisoned, he has the body of a penguin, a mouth of a whale, walks as slow as a turtle, and then they covered him in weird feathers. I think those are feathers, they kind of look like fluffy scales. However, the giant penguin whale is like 40 feet tall and can swallow Link whole. But the true form of Demise is just a flamer on steroids. Like, if I had to pick a fight between Godzilla or The Rock, I would absolutely choose The Rock. Yeah, he'd still kick my candy ass, but he is still less intimidating than Godzilla. And I think that's how some people in the audience would feel. They would probably see Demise as the less intimidating form, which is probably why Ganondorf usually transforms into his beast form after Link has battled him in his human form. Because the beast form is usually the form that's more intimidating and scary. Except in Twilight Princess, but his boar form kind of sucked for that game, so maybe that's why they went first. It was practically just a bullfight. Olé. But the true form of demise, you would obviously need to keep. Just like you would obviously keep Link and Zelda. Without these three characters, it's not Skyward Sword. The core of this story is about two friends stopping the evil demon that curses them in their final breath to be reincarnated and fight the same fight over and over again, which sets up so many different future stories and establishes why we keep seeing similar characters pop up over and over. So instead of going into detail about Link and Zelda in this section, I'm going to talk about them in the next section when we talk about act structure, because Act 1 is all about Link and Zelda. One of the things that Skyward Sword does the best is establish a real relationship between Link and Zelda, because most of the games, they don't do that. Look at Ocarina of Time as an example. In the first half of that game, Zelda is just there to give exposition and tell Link what to do. Twilight Princess? Yeah, she's barely in it. Then if we switch over to Breath of the Wild, Link is essentially a bodyguard for Zelda whose duty it is to follow her around and be a badass. But Skyward Sword actually gives us two lifelong friends who care about each other, and this is perfect for a movie. It gets the audience to care about these characters. And because this is the first film, we absolutely have to make the audience fall in love with these characters. The audience has to care as much about Zelda and Link as Zelda and Link care about each other. This also gives Link a true motivation to go on this journey because it's personal. You know, he's not trying to save the world just because he's destined to. He is saving his best friend, a loved one, someone he would go to the ends of the world for 3 different times. And that's why the first act of this movie needs to focus on these two characters. That being said, I still think we need to make some changes from how the video game does it. For example, the competition of the wing ceremony is probably something we should not do. Like, yeah, it could be a cool, fun action sequence, but it has nothing to do with Zelda and Link other than the fact that whoever wins the competition gets to be on the statue with Zelda at the end, but we don't need a competition to do that. In fact, I don't think they need to get on the statue at all because pretty much the only reason they go up there is so you can establish how Link uses his sailcloth. It's like a game mechanic hidden within a story mechanic. It's basically Inception. I also think we should see them as kids so we can get a sense of how long they've been friends, and how long Groose has been jealous of their friendship. Technically, we could just say that to the audience, but it's always better to show rather than tell. We also need to establish Link is well-trained and a good fighter. That way the audience can believe he can handle himself when he goes down to the surface world, because Link obviously isn't gonna go through weeks of battling, completing temples, and fighting dozens of bosses to make it believable he could fight the big bad at the end. So we have to establish him as someone who can handle himself in a battle before he even has to battle. I guess if you really wanted him to start off very unprepared, you could always do a montage of him accomplishing goals and getting better before he goes on to fight Demise. Or he starts off as that bumbling buffoon that happens to win the day thanks to the help of his friends. But I think especially for this particular movie, you want him to start off as very skilled. You want the audience to take this character seriously, and you don't want them to sit there and wonder by the end of the film, how is that kid with 0 combat skills able to take down something called the Demon King? And so it just seems like having him start off well-trained is the best approach. So as long as the writer can find an entertaining way to establish that Link is a good fighter, set up the deep relationship between Link and Zelda, and capture the magic of this island in the sky, I would say that they have done a good job adapting this first act. Because once we have that inciting incident where Zelda falls down to the surface, which is the catalyst to make our main character go on a journey, that's what an inciting incident is. It's an incident that incites a journey or adventure or whatever we're going on. So if the writer can do all of that well and get us to the inciting incident, the rest of the first act will be easy to adapt. Link can have a heart-to-heart with Gaepora about Zelda missing, then have Fi guide him to the Goddess Sword, explain what happened long ago, and then take him to the surface world. And that's where Act 2 kicks off. Now the one thing that I want to point out before we move on to Act 2 is that we probably shouldn't start off the movie with the same intro from the game. Because when Link hears Fi tell him this information, then it's the information the audience already knows and you're just repeating yourself. So you should absolutely just hold off until Link gets that information. That's why in my next video, when I give my Skyward Sword pitch, or whatever I'm calling it, that's the reason my opener is very different. It's a scene you've never seen in the game, but it starts us off with a sense of mystery, action, and establishes the childhood friendship between Link and Zelda, and then ends with giving the audience a sense of wonder as the title of the movie comes across the screen. Or at least I think it accomplishes that. Maybe it doesn't, I don't know. And that brings us to Act 2. And just like how Act 1 leads into Act 2, Act 2 is gonna bring us into Act 3. That's so weird, right? You're shocked. This film's crazy, I know, man. But I bring this up because where the story goes in Act 2 has to lead us to the ending we know will happen, which is Link saving the world by defeating Demise, and then a curse is placed to set up these three characters battling over and over again in the future. In the game version, the things that lead up to that moment are Link finding Zelda, Link completing the Master Sword, and then Link finding the Triforce to destroy Demise, only for Girahim to kidnap Zelda, go back in time, and then use her to resurrect Demise. And as I said earlier, we don't got time for all that. Especially because we'll need to introduce Girahim so Link has an actual antagonist until Demise is resurrected. We'll need to introduce two versions of Impa so Link and Zelda will each have someone to help them. We're gonna need to try and show off the 4 main areas of the surface world. And we need to create another deep relationship, but this time between Link and Fi, since they'll be together for a big portion of this movie. And because we want her goodbye moment to really pay off. And again, even if we had all the time in the world, it would still be a lot of wash, rinse, and repeat. Hypothetically, you could condense it so he's accomplishing a different task in each one of the provinces, but then it just becomes a list of things he needs to do, and it's unlikely that the story will change from province to province. That's why my suggestion is to completely get rid of the Triforce in this movie. While I do enjoy the plot twist that it gives us, we're already introducing so many Legend of Zelda elements to a brand new audience. That also introducing the Triforce, how it works, and all those rules that come with it, is not worth cramming it into the movie. I also have to admit that I'm against it because it technically creates a new timeline which isn't talked about in the game, but think about it. Link goes back in time to defeat Demise, which means there's a timeline where Zelda never falls to the surface because there's no one for Girahim to resurrect. Yeah, that's another animated film I actually really want to see. So Nintendo, if you're watching, just go ahead and add that to my list. And yeah, I know what some of you are gonna say. It's because it's a loop. You know, it just always happened that way. That's why it makes sense. But does it though? Like does it? I mean, in a universe where we've already established that there is a multiverse, there are different timelines due to time travel. We are simultaneously gonna say that yeah, loops do happen, where, you know, there is no timeline where Girahim never went back in time to unseal Demise. It just so happens that sometimes time travel creates new timelines and sometimes it always happened that way. And there's also just little things like Demise turning into vapor and getting absorbed into the sword as opposed to going back underground. So it's like, if it's a loop, why are we watching him get absorbed into the sword when he's supposedly just going back underground and getting resealed there? In like a scene we didn't see, did Link plunge the sword into the bottom of that hole to put Demise back where he came from? I mean, I know that they technically put the sword in the temple, but the temple isn't, I mean, I guess it's close to the hole. But then that's my other issue, is if the Master Sword is plunged into the temple, why is it that we don't see it throughout the entire game? And people are like, oh, well, that's because Impa brings it out. And I'm like, wait, so you can just move the Master Sword around willy-nilly? I always thought it was the chosen hero that could take it out of the pedestal. I mean, I guess if you leave it in the pedestal, then you can just do whatever you want with it, and that's weird. But no matter if you think it's a time split or a loop, or you just don't think the writers knew how to end it well, that third choice is probably the correct choice. The ending is a little bit sloppy and we need to rework it. And I think one of the best ways to do that is by taking out the Triforce, especially if you're gonna make a Wind Waker movie at some point. Because just like Skyward Sword, towards the end of Wind Waker, they make a wish on the Triforce, except for the wish in the Wind Waker is gonna seem kinda dumb compared to Skyward Sword if you do Skyward Sword first. I mean, if Skyward Sword Link wishes for the evil to be eradicated, and then the King of Red Lions a few movies later is just like, oh hey, just give these kids a future. Nah, Ganondorf's fine, just give these kids a future. Like, the audience will judge him. Because a future, like, what does that even mean? They could be enslaved by Ganondorf as a future. Like, it's definitely not as good as wishing for the evil thing right in front of you to be eradicated. So by letting Link wish the far superior wish in this movie, it undercuts the wish in a later movie. But thematically, the Wind Waker version is just so much better because it's about, you know, ditching the old, embracing the new, not holding on to the past, all that kind of stuff. And this one's just like, yeah, get rid of evil. That's the theme here. Now to circle back to my main point, I don't think the Triforce should be in this movie, which means Link won't be searching for it in Act 2. So I think the focus of Act 2 should be finding Zelda and the creation of the Master Sword. Because what this section needs to be about is creating the weapon that will defeat Demise and all the future incarnations. It also gives the story more depth because Fi is a part of the Master Sword and becomes sealed away inside of it forever. So just imagine you're creating an item alongside your friend, only to find out your friend is basically going to imprison themselves in it forever, which is another reason why Act 2 needs to focus on the friendship between Link and Fi. Because that aspect of the plot has emotion, it has stakes, and the Triforce doesn't. In fact, in the next video when I'm pitching Skyward Sword, I actually made it so in order to complete the Master Sword, Fi has to be sealed away in the Master Sword before they take on Demise. This raises the emotion of that moment because Link doesn't want to trade one friend's life for another, but he knows he has to. It's the reason Fi was created in the first place, and she is more than happy to go through with it because she wants to protect Link, Zelda, and the rest of the world. But Link doesn't want to sacrifice his new friend, and at first he refuses, he can't accept it. But eventually, he knows that the only way to move forward and save Zelda is by letting Fi sacrifice herself. And that's why I feel like regardless of how they structure Act 2, it needs to build up to that moment. You could hold off until the end of the movie, just like the video game does, but I feel like it's so less impactful. Of course, that's not the end of Act 2, that's getting close to the end of Act 2, but that's not quite the end. You see, the end of Act 2 is usually the hope is lost moment. Okay, technically it's called All is Lost instead of Hope is Lost, but I just like Hope is Lost more because all just, it sounds way over dramatic. Like really everything is just old is lost. Like, come on. You're being a bit of a drama queen. And for this particular script, I think it's very obvious that that moment is when Zelda starts having her soul devoured and Demise gets resurrected. This is clearly Link's lowest of low moments because his whole goal has been to rescue Zelda, and it looks like he may not accomplish that goal. I mean, she's literally being consumed at that moment. It doesn't get worse than that. And of course, that leads us straight into Act 3. But before we go on to Act 3, I do want to point out really quick that there are so many different things that you could do in Act 2. Like, yes, I do think that there are specific things that it should do, like create the Master Sword, develop the relationship between Link and Fi, and that the final moment of Act 2 should be Demise's resurrection. And at the end of the day, Link's super objective is to rescue his friend, Zelda. So a super objective is essentially the objective throughout the entire story for our main character. That's why it's called a super objective. It's a little bit more important than the regular objectives. It's super. But outside of that, I feel like there's a lot of freedom. For example, even though the game had you go and get a bunch of sacred flames in order to complete the Master Sword, that doesn't need to be the case here. And just because Zelda needs to go back in time at one point, that doesn't mean Link needs to chase her through every single province to get to that point. Maybe by the time Link gets down there, she's already gone through the Gate of Time. Maybe as soon as he lands on the surface world, he watches her go through the Gate of Time because she's running from Girahim. These are the kinds of things that you can play around with. Just like in Act 1, before we get to the inciting incident, there's a lot of different things you can do to help develop the relationship between Link and Zelda. So there is a lot of room to play around here, especially because Act 2 is usually the biggest part of the script. The one last thing that I'll say is even though I really emphasize the idea of sacrificing Fi before Link goes through the Gate of Time to meet up with Zelda, I will say that there is a moment in Act 3 where that could also potentially work. I still think waiting until after the fight with Demise is a terrible decision, but if you wanted to write it so it was right before the fight with Demise, or even during the fight with Demise, I do think that that could also work. My only issue with it is that if you wait until later, then that moment doesn't get to breathe as much. But if you choose to do it before Link goes through the Gate of Time, there is no rush. So Link and Fi can have a real discussion about it. And it could seem more emotional because it seems like there's actually a choice. But if Demise has been resurrected and he is moments away from devouring Zelda and taking over the world, there is no time to argue about it. And there's no time for Link to mourn because he's got to go right back into battle. That being said, it would make the battle much more climactic because there was a sacrifice right in the middle of it. And since I'm already talking about the battle, let's go ahead and transition into Act 3. This battle is the climax of the movie, and the climax is essentially where Act 3 starts. Now, of course, how we get to that point is a little bit different than how it happens in the game. Again, the Triforce did not destroy Demise in the present timeline, and Girahim did not have to go back in time in order to resurrect Demise. If you really want him to go back in time, I guess you can, even though I don't think it really makes sense to. Also, if you wanted to add in one last battle with Girahim, you could totally add that to make it seem like, oh, he just needs to beat Girahim and then Zelda's gonna be saved. And then, oh no, Demise has been resurrected. Demise now kills Girahim to make him his sword. And this battle has just started. But you could also take this moment out if you felt like the final action sequence felt a little bit too long. Other than that, there's not really a lot more to change. Link is gonna have the big fight with Demise. He's obviously going to win and save the world. Demise is gonna lay down that curse. And then everything wraps up where the world is saved, everyone is happy, but it's a little bit somber because they lost Fi in the process. And the characters of course know that this isn't truly the end because of the curse. But it is safe for now, and that's why everyone from Skyloft finally returns down to the surface world. And that's it! That is how you adapt The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. For the most part. Let's go into my final thoughts. Out of the 5 games that I chose to adapt, this was the easiest one because we have character motivation, we have meaningful relationships, the main character has to make a sacrifice, and best of all, Link has different objectives other than collecting things. That's not to say I'm right about everything in this video. I obviously gave some different approaches here and there, and I think that's the important thing to remember. Because even though I am dead set on Link and Zelda establishing a relationship in the first act, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. And in my next video, while I do choose specific paths and give more details on what I would do to set up that relationship, at least in a first draft outline, what I ended up writing isn't the only way to write it. So even though it doesn't happen in my example, maybe Zelda is kidnapped and that's why Link needs to create the Master Sword. Maybe Link goes back in time and he's trying to create the Master Sword in order to get back to the present. There is definitely room to make changes and play around, and I think that's what people need to remember when watching these videos. There are things that are absolute, there are things you should throw out, and then there's piles of maybes. So keep that in mind because this series is more of a guide rather than a Bible. And this next video is me using the guide to show you how potentially that guide could work. Now I know exactly what all of you are wondering. Anyone who didn't like Skyward Sword has been waiting for me to shut up about Skyward Sword and find out what game should be adapted next. And for anyone sitting there thinking, oh, it's gotta be Minish Cap since it's next in the timeline. That's not it, sorry. We just got done doing a movie about creating the Master Sword. We don't need the sequel to be about creating the 4 swords. I will admit that I actually wanted to do a different game than the next one I chose because I wanted to reuse this incarnation of Zelda and Link. The problem is, I think the 4 Swords games should have their own arc, so I couldn't use any of them. You can't do any of the games that have Ganondorf as the main antagonist without doing Ocarina of Time first. And I kinda wanted to do Twilight Princess and just take out Ganondorf and let Zant be the true villain as we learn about the Twilight Realm and the Interloper War. But we still wouldn't be able to use the same incarnation of Zelda and Link because during the Twilight Princess story, we have to flash back to the Interloper War, which happened long, long ago, but should also take place after Skyward Sword because the Interlopers try to take the Triforce from the Sacred Realm, but in Skyward Sword, it sounded like the world lives in peace and prosperity until Demise showed up. And then they moved the Triforce to the sky, so that would mean they either tried to steal the Triforce from Skyloft or before Demise ever existed in a time where there was supposedly no evil. Maybe it could work, but it definitely didn't seem that way when I was trying to force it in. However, the next game I picked out does make a lot of sense to do next. We just introduced a villain and promised he would be back in another life, so it makes sense to drop this incarnation of Zelda and Link and let the next adaptation be about that. So the next game to be adapted will be The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which is the other reason I thought it was best to not include the Triforce in Skyward Sword, because it plays a much more important role in the next game we're tackling, and probably gives the best and most thorough understanding of the Triforce than any other game. And because so many people consider Ocarina of Time their favorite Zelda game, I can imagine how many of you are excited to hear this, which also means there's gonna be lots of nerd rage when you find out all the reasons it can't be too faithful of an adaptation. There's just too much stacked against it, or at least a big part of it. But that of course will be discussed in another video. Because before we tackle Ocarina of Time and get into what you can and can't do when adapting that game, I'll be giving a detailed outline of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Like this video if you're enjoying this content, dislike this video if I'm ruining your childhood, your memories, and your favorite video game franchise of all time. Comment down below about the things you agree with or disagree with, or, if you think Skyward Sword should be the first adaptation. But most importantly, if you're not subscribed yet, Make sure you're subscribed so you can see the future videos on Ocarina of Time and other Legend of Zelda video games getting adapted. Otherwise, until next time, I'll catch you later.